Welcome to Hidden Wonders, a channel where we venture into the dusty corners of the past to uncover forgotten facts and strange history. We explore unbelievable true stories that most people never knew even existed. If you find yourself fascinated by the mysterious and the overlooked, please remember to like and subscribe to help support our journey through time. Today we dive into a tale that defies logic and reason and the simple truth. In this video, we explore one of history's most baffling events. It is a story of a powerful nation that accidentally went to war with its own shadow. We will look at how confusion and simple miscommunication turned an elite fighting force into its own worst enemy. Join us as we unravel the strange conflict that resulted in thousands of casualties, all without a single enemy soldier ever stepping onto the field of battle. Chapter 1. The March of Shadows. The year is 1788, and the air across the Austrian Empire is heavy with the scent of impending conflict. Emperor Joseph II is preparing for a grand campaign against the Ottoman Turks. As the sun sets over the rolling hills, a massive force begins to move toward the border. It is an army of nearly 100,000 men, a true titan of the 18th century era. This vast gathering of soldiers was a sight to behold, stretching for miles across the landscape like a winding river of steel and fabric. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies, while horses neighed in the cool evening air. Yet this was no ordinary army. It was a complex machine built from many different parts, each piece moving in rhythm with a grand imperial vision that sought to expand the borders of the empire. The most striking feature of this force was its incredible diversity. Within the ranks, men from across the continent marched side by side. There were Austrians and Hungarians, Serbs and Croats, and many others from the far reaches of the imperial lands. As many as a dozen different languages could be heard echoing through the camps each night, creating a vibrant tapestry of culture, but also a potential for deep and dangerous confusion now. The march toward the border was conducted with a sense of calm and order. The narrator observes the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots hitting the earth, creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and the polished bayonets caught the fading light of the day. Everything appeared to be in perfect alignment for a glorious victory, at least on the surface of things and plans. However, beneath this outward show of strength, a subtle tension began to simmer. It was not a fear of the enemy, but a growing unease born from the sheer scale of the operation. In such a multinational force, the threads of communication were thin and easily frayed. The soldiers relied on their officers for every command, but those commands often had to travel through several translations before reaching the ears of the common men. Logistics in the 18th century were a nightmare of coordination. Feeding and housing 100,000 soldiers required a precision that was difficult to maintain, especially when the troops could barely understand one another. As they moved deeper into the borderlands, the supplies began to stretch thin, and the silence of the night was often broken by the sounds of different tongues arguing over rations or the best path forward through the woods and hills. One cannot help but wonder how such a powerful and sophisticated force could be undone. They were trained for traditional warfare, for facing a clear enemy across an open field, yet history tells us that their greatest threat was not waiting across the border. Instead, the seeds of their destruction were already being sown within their own ranks, buried deep in the simple lack of understanding that plagued the diverse and crowded army camps. As the army neared the town of Karnsebys, the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. The soldiers believed they were preparing for a decisive battle against the Ottomans. They checked their gear and sharpened their blades, unaware that the path they were on was leading toward a disaster unlike any other. It was a moment of quiet before a storm of their own making would sweep through the valley and change history forever and ever. The mental toll of the march was beginning to show on the faces of the tired men. They were far from home, surrounded by strangers who shared their uniform but not their words. In the flickering light of the campfires, the shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own, whispering of the chaos to come. The grand scale of the empire felt both comforting and claustrophobic in the vast and empty wilderness. We are left to ponder the fragility of power when it is built on a foundation of miscommunication. The stage is now set for a series of events so bizarre they seem almost impossible to believe. But in the world of true history, the truth is often stranger than fiction. As the shadows lengthen over the Austrian camp, we prepare to witness the beginning of a tactical disaster that remains a haunting mystery for all. Chapter 2. The Spark in the Dark. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and river mud as a small scouting party of hussars moved quietly through the woods. They were the eyes and ears of the army, searching for any sign of the Ottoman forces. As they crossed the shallow waters near the town of Carnsabes, the soldiers remained alert, their hands resting nervously on the hilts of their sabers. Emerging from the dense tree line, the hussars did not find the feared enemy they expected. Instead, they stumbled upon a small group of local travelers, their carts laden with barrels of schnapps. The travelers were more than happy to sell their spirits to the weary soldiers. It seemed like a stroke of luck, a brief moment of warmth and comfort in the middle of a cold, uncertain, and very long night indeed now. The hussars decided to buy several barrels of the potent alcohol, intending to enjoy a quick drink before continuing their mission. They began to set up a small camp, laughing and sharing stories as the schnapps began to take effect. The tension of the battlefield seemed to melt away, replaced by the hazy glow of the spirits. Little did they know, this simple act of indulgence would soon lead to an absolute disaster. While the hussars were enjoying their newfound prize, a group of infantrymen arrived at the riverbank. They had been marching for hours and were exhausted, hungry, and extremely thirsty. When they saw the cavalrymen drinking and celebrating, they naturally expected to be invited to join in the festivities. They approached the hussars with hope in their eyes, asking for a share of the schnapps to help ease their own heavy burdens that night. However, the hussars were in no mood to share. Fueled by the alcohol and a sense of superiority, they flatly refused the request of the foot soldiers. The infantrymen felt insulted and angry, believing they were just as entitled to the spirits as the men on horseback. A simple request quickly turned into a heated argument, with both sides raising their voices and hurling insults back and forth across the darkening forest clearing. The tension in the air grew thick and heavy, mirroring the dark clouds gathering above. What started as a verbal spat soon escalated into a physical confrontation. Soldiers began to push and shove, their tempers flared by the alcohol and the stress of the impending war. The forest, once silent, was now filled with the sounds of grunts and the clatter of heavy equipment. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of all control. In the midst of the chaotic scuffle, a single shot rang out. It was a sharp, piercing sound that sliced through the night like a cold knife. No one knew who had fired it, or if it was even intentional. The effect, however, was immediate and profound. The sound of gunfire in the dark was the ultimate trigger, turning a drunken brawl into a scene of pure and absolute terror for everyone involved. Suddenly, a panicked voice screamed from the shadows. "Turks," the voice cried out, echoing through the trees and across the river. The word itself was enough to send a wave of horror through the ranks. For weeks, the soldiers had lived in fear of an Ottoman ambush, and now it seemed their nightmares had finally come true. The simple shout acted like a spark, igniting a massive wildfire of panic among the men. The cry of Turks was picked up by others, spreading like a contagion through the scouting party and the infantry. In the darkness, every shadow became an enemy soldier, and every rustle of leaves became an advancing army. The hussars scrambled for their horses, while the foot soldiers grabbed their muskets, firing blindly into the trees. The order and discipline of the army vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate and frantic scramble for survival. Men began to run in every direction, tripping over roots and splashing through the river in their haste to escape the perceived threat. The confusion was absolute as soldiers from the same army began to fire upon one another, believing they were defending themselves against a hidden foe. The dark forest became a maze of fear, where friend and enemy were indistinguishable, and the only goal was to flee from the phantom invaders. The panic did not stay confined to the riverbank. It rippled outwards, reaching the main body of the army camp nearby. The sounds of shouting and gunfire were misinterpreted by the resting troops as a full-scale attack. Officers tried to restore order, but their commands were lost in the roar of the crowd. The chain reaction of terror was now unstoppable, fueled by the very miscommunications that would define this strange night. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most bizarre events in military history. What began as a simple dispute over a bottle of schnapps had transformed into a self-inflicted catastrophe. As the night deepened, the Austrian army would continue to fight a war against itself, unaware that the true enemy was miles away. The spark in the dark had ignited a flame that would consume their dignity and their strength. Chapter 3. The Symphony of Confusion. The cry of Turks ripples through the air like a cold wind, reaching the heart of the camp where the rest of the army waits in uneasy silence. What was once a minor scuffle at the river has now morphed into a full-scale nightmare. Men are jolted from their sleep by the sounds of distant screaming and the frantic pounding of heavy leather boots across the hard ground. The dark Austrian camp is no longer a place of rest, but a cauldron of pure terror. As the warning spreads from one tent to the next, the soldiers grab their weapons in a blind panic. They do not see an enemy, but they feel its presence in every single shadow around them. The night is thick with the smell of damp earth and the growing scent of fear that binds them all tightly together. High-ranking officers try to step into the growing fray, hoping to stem the tide of madness before it consumes the entire force. They shout the command of halt at the top of their lungs, hoping to stop the fleeing hussars and infantrymen. It is a simple order meant to restore order and discipline. But in this multi-ethnic army, the word itself becomes a spark that ignites a much larger and far deadlier kind of fire. The Austrian military is a collection of different cultures and languages, many of whom do not understand German commands at all. To the ears of the non-German-speaking soldiers, the desperate shouts of halt sound terrifyingly familiar. In the echoes of the night, they misinterpret the word as Allah, the famous battle cry of the Ottoman Turks. This single linguistic mistake transforms their own officers into the very demons they fear the most right now. The realization hits like a sharp physical blow, spreading through the ranks with incredible speed. They believe the enemy has breached the perimeter and is already among them, shouting their war cries as they strike from the dark. The confusion is total and devastating. Every man looks at his neighbor with suspicion, wondering if the figure standing in the gloom is a comrade or a Turkish invader who is ready to take a human life. Beneath the pitch black sky, the only sources of light are the flickering orange glow of lanterns and the sudden bursts of muzzle flashes. These brief moments of illumination do not offer clarity, but instead create a strobe-like effect that distorts reality. Men see shapes moving in the periphery and react with instinctive violence, pulling triggers before they even know what they are targeting in the chaotic and extremely confusing landscape of the main army camp. Musket fire begins to crackle like dry wood in a bonfire, starting as a few isolated shots before growing into a thunderous roar. The soldiers are no longer fighting a war of strategy, but a war of survival against an invisible and overwhelming force. They fire blindly into the trees and the empty spaces between the tents, convinced that the Turkish army is pouring into the camp from every single direction on this terrible night. The tragedy of the situation is profound, as the army begins to systematically destroy itself from within. There are no Ottoman soldiers for miles, yet the Austrians are engaged in a fierce battle. Each flash of light reveals a fallen soldier in a familiar uniform, but the panicked mind sees only a disguised enemy. The bond of brotherhood is completely dissolved, replaced by a primal urge to kill or be killed by those standing nearby. Cannons are eventually brought into the mix, their deep booms shaking the ground and adding to the sensory overload. The smoke from the black powder hangs heavy in the still night air, creating a thick fog that makes it even harder to see. It is a symphony of confusion where the instruments are screams and gunfire, and the conductor is a deep-seated terror that no one can seem to escape in this moment of madness. Men fall by the hundreds, struck down by the very people they marched with just days ago. The camp becomes a labyrinth of death, where every corner turned leads to another potential confrontation with a friend turned into a foe. The officers have lost all control, their voices drowned out by the cacophony of war that they inadvertently helped to create. It is a scene of absolute and heartbreaking devastation for everyone involved in it. The irony of the language barrier is the most bitter part of this historical disaster. A single word meant to stop the chaos instead became the catalyst for its ultimate escalation. As the night drags on, the exhausted and terrified men continue their struggle against the ghosts of their own making. They are trapped in a nightmare where the truth is hidden by the dark and the lies are told by echoing voices and shadows. By the time the sun begins to peek over the horizon, the camp is a scarred landscape of wreckage and loss. The invisible enemy has vanished with the stars, leaving behind a grim reality that is almost too strange to believe. This was not a defeat at the hands of a foreign power, but a self-inflicted wound born from the simple failure to understand one another in the deep dark of a lonely night sky. Chapter 4. The Silence of the Sun. As the first golden rays of dawn began to peek over the rugged horizon, the thick clouds of smoke from the previous night's intense battle finally started to clear. The survivors stood in a daze, looking out over the valley that had been filled with the sounds of chaos and cannon fire. What they saw in the light was truly haunting, a scene of absolute and total devastation. The landscape was littered with thousands of casualties, men who had fought bravely against an enemy they never actually saw. Abandoned supplies were scattered everywhere, heavy wagons overturned and crates of ammunition left behind in the frantic retreat. The once proud and organized army was now nothing more than a broken collection of lost souls, wandering through the morning mist with expressions of pure shock, wondering what had truly happened during that long dark morning. Officers moved through the ranks, searching for any sign of the Ottoman forces they believed they had been engaging all night long. They looked for prisoners, they looked for fallen enemies, and they looked for the banners of the opposing army, but there was absolutely nothing to be found. The fields were empty of anyone but their own people. The terrifying realization began to settle into the weary minds of the confused military leadership now. It was a moment of profound and stinging silence. They had not been attacked by a foreign power or a stealthy raiding party. Instead, they had spent the entire night waging a desperate war against their own shadows. Every shot fired and every scream heard was the result of their own fear. They had managed to defeat themselves in the most spectacular and tragic way imaginable, leaving only ghosts behind in the rising morning light. The army leaders stood staring at the maps that now felt utterly meaningless. How could such a massive force, tens of thousands of trained soldiers, fall into such a state of total madness? The reports coming in from various units were filled with conflicting accounts. Some claimed they were surrounded, while others insisted they had seen monsters moving in the darkness. The truth was far simpler and much more difficult to accept than any fiction. Among the wreckage of the camp, the true cost of the mistake was becoming painfully clear. Thousands lay wounded or dead, not by the hand of a foe, but by the panicked fire of their own comrades. The medics worked in a state of disbelief, trying to make sense of injuries that should never have happened. It was a scene of misery that defied all logic, a tragedy born entirely from thin air and false alarms. As the sun rose higher, the official reports began to be drafted, and they were nothing short of absurd. Officers tried to find ways to explain the loss of life without admitting the embarrassing truth. They spoke of mysterious invaders, yet the lack of a single enemy body made these stories fall apart. It was an impossible task to justify such a disaster without revealing the sheer incompetence that had taken place in the dark. The army was now scattered across the countryside, drifting away in smaller groups like leaves caught in a cold wind. Many soldiers simply walked away, tired of the confusion and the senseless violence they had witnessed. The grand mission they had set out on was now a distant memory, replaced by a desperate need for safety and clarity, searching for a way to explain the unexplainable to those waiting for them back in their homes. When the scouts finally returned from the distance, they brought the most shocking news of all. The actual Ottoman army was still days away, marching slowly and completely unaware that a battle had even taken place. They had been moving through distant hills while their opponents were busy destroying themselves. The irony was thick enough to choke those who had managed to survive a night of pure terror and a morning of heavy utter silence. This event would go down in history as one of the most bizarre and tragic blunders ever recorded. It was a stark reminder of how fragile order can be when fear takes hold. The silence of the morning sun served as a witness to the folly of man, highlighting the dangerous power of a simple and deadly misunderstanding. There were no winners here, only a quiet valley and the heavy weight of lasting regret and shame. The immediate aftermath was a scramble for blame, with different factions pointing fingers at each other to avoid the shame. The chain of command had completely dissolved, and trust between the ranks was shattered. No one wanted to take responsibility for the thousands of lives lost to a ghost army. It was a dark stain on their military record, one that would be discussed for centuries, a symbol of what happens when logic is lost. As the survivors finally began their long walk home, the sun was fully up, shining brightly over a battlefield that held no glory. The story of this self-inflicted war would eventually reach the ears of the world, serving as a cautionary tale about the shadows we create. The silence of the sun was the only answer to a night of absolute and total madness, a lesson written in the dust of an empty valley. Chapter 5. The echoes of Khanzabes. Long after the dust settled on that chaotic night, the story of Khanzabes began to fade into the quiet corners of history. Why would an empire want to remember a night where it fought its own reflection? This strange event was tucked away, hidden behind more glorious victories, but its silence speaks louder than any cannon blast about the nature of human error and pride. For decades, historians debated whether the Battle of Khanzabes actually happened as described, or if it was merely an exaggerated tale of military incompetence. Yet, the records of the Austrian hospital and the sudden retreat of the army provide a sobering reality. It serves as a haunting reminder of how easily a massive force can crumble from within, when trust is replaced by panic, and when words lose their meaning entirely. Looking back at the ruins of that night, we see the fragility of the structures we build to keep us safe. An army is more than just soldiers and steel. It is a network of communication and shared purpose. When that network fails, the most advanced military in the world becomes nothing more than a frightened crowd in the dark. Karn Sabers remains a unique, if embarrassing, case study in the ultimate breakdown of command. The incident highlights the complex nature of the Holy Roman Empire at that time, a vast patchwork of languages and cultures. Communication was already a delicate thread, and in the heat of a perceived battle, that thread snapped with devastating consequences. We must wonder how many other moments in history were shaped by such simple, yet profound, misunderstandings that never made it into the official chronicles of the great powers 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 of the world. There is a deep lesson here about collective fear, a force that can blind even the most disciplined minds. Once the first shot was fired, reason was abandoned. The soldiers were not fighting the Ottomans, they were fighting their own shadows and the terrifying stories they had told themselves around the campfire. Fear has a way of turning allies into enemies, making the familiar look like a threat and the silence feel like an ambush. The story of the Schnapps and the Hussars might seem like a dark comedy, but it illustrates the high cost of a single missed word. If the soldiers had shared a common language, or if the officers had maintained control, the tragedy could have been avoided entirely. It shows us that clarity is the foundation of order, and without it, the very systems designed to protect us can become the instruments of our own destruction. Sometimes, the stories that are forgotten are the ones that teach us the most. The Battle of Karn Sabes was buried because it did not fit the narrative of imperial glory. It was a glitch in the machine of history, a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos that defied logic. By examining these anomalies, we gain a better understanding of the human element that exists within every major event, the unpredictable spark of human nature. Even the greatest empires are built on the fragile cooperation of individuals. When that cooperation dissolves, the empire itself begins to tremble. Karn Sabes was a microcosm of this reality, showing how a small disagreement over a barrel of alcohol could escalate into a full-scale retreat. It reminds us that the course of history is not always decided by great generals or grand strategies, but sometimes by the smallest, most mundane of human interactions. As we look back through the lens of time, we can see the battle with a sense of curious detachment. We can analyze the mistakes and identify the turning points where things went wrong. But for the men on the ground, there was no perspective, only the terrifying reality of a night filled with screams and gunfire. Their experience serves as a testament to the power of the moment to override logic and common sense. History is often written by the victors, but in this case, there were no victors, only survivors of a self-inflicted wound. This is why the story is so fascinating. It pulls back the curtain on the messy, unorganized reality of war. It challenges us to look beyond the polished accounts of heroism and explore the strange truths that lie in the shadows. There is much to learn from the moments when things fall apart. The silence of the history books regarding Karn Sabes is perhaps the most interesting part of the legacy. It shows how we choose to remember only what makes us feel strong or righteous. By bringing these forgotten tales back into the light, we honor the complexity of the human journey. We acknowledge that we are capable of great things, but also of spectacular failures that can change the world in ways we never expected. As we finish our journey through this strange chapter of the past, let us carry with us the lesson of Karn Sabes. Let us remember the importance of clear communication, the dangers of unchecked fear, and the profound impact of the smallest misunderstanding. History is not just a collection of dates and names, it is a reflection of ourselves. Thank you for exploring the hidden wonders of our world with us. Until our next journey.